here we are.
Right. Good afternoon, David.
Good afternoon, Mark. We've had a little technical difficulty here.
Right, and I hear you're reduced to primitive technology.
The handset.
Osama bin Laden technology.
Exactly, the Waziristan.
Do you have a pasted-on beard? I can't see you. So.
That's the Grecian formula, yeah.
Right. So we are really talking on your moment of fame here.
Yes, it's a weird kind of thing, actually, because the whole to those of you those who don't know, Osama bin Laden's speech paraphrased a line from a book that Richard Pearl and I wrote, and I didn't think he'd read it, but he was very hostile to the book. I mean, in fact, it sort of overlapped with a lot of the negative reviews we got. Some of the more liberal journals saying that Frum and Pearl believe in the inherence of conflict, which we don't, but I'm not going to go contradict a fugitive like that. But and then went on to say that the truer path is offered by Noam Chomsky and Michael Schlinger. and a lot of people who may be a little uncomfortable to discover they have a kindred soul. I mean, the whole thing sounded like something written by Naomi Klein.
Right. Was this in the part of the tape that was sort of a freeze frame? You know, there's some controversy about whether the tape, that everything that refers to more recent events was in this kind of freeze frame section of the tape?
It was very near the top. I was reading it from the MSNBC translation transcript. But yeah, we got good placement. He did seem to be kind of mad about the things, or whoever wrote the speech was mad about some of the things Richard and I had said about him. So I take that as a compliment.
I think that's a reasonably good endorsement. It's funny when it first came out, and I hadn't heard that you were mentioned, and I heard the thing about Noam Chomsky. I was thinking it would be a great little plot. It would be a great starter for a comic novel. I have all these little pieces of comic novels to write. Like sort of some young, medium leftist academic writes a book that basically nobody reads, and then all of a sudden it gets mentioned. You know, Osama bin Laden mentions it in a videotape, and sort of, you know, you could then you just start the plot from there to see what happens. And then I found out that here you are, but not quite in the same terms. So have you gotten fan mail as a result, or anything like that?
Remarkably little. I think his audience, his constituency, may have shriveled somewhat. He doesn't, and I don't know, as I say, that the no logo crowd is going to appreciate this kind of outreach from an attempt to persuade them that Islam really is the. Although it's true, actually, that Osama bin Laden's Islam would put an end to all the whole logo, industrialization, cities problem.
But he also joined the no taxes crowd. He also joined the sort of Mike Huckabee wing of the Republican Party. Right?
That's right. Well, that's right. Well, they're user fees.
So you've got Osama bin Laden, the Scientologists, and most of the Republican presidential field kind of in the same.
But do note he does intend to impose user fees.
Yes. Okay, fair.
Revenue enhancements.
Right. Small money, get rid of waste, fraud, and abuse, and the rest will take care of itself. Well, I'm glad to do this. I actually wanted to do this 2 or 3 weeks ago when Bob suggested it, because I really found so much that provoked my thinking in your op-ed about Karl Rove's resignation from the White House, which is now so long in the past that it has fallen behind the Time Select subscription wall. So normally, as a good blogger, I would refuse to even mention it.
It's like all of 4 weeks ago.
Right. It was, I think, August 14th, but I did actually reread it today. So
thank you.
Unfortunately, only the Times Select equipped among the Blogging Heads viewers will be able to get it. But there was a passage in there that I found fascinating, where you made the analogy from your time as a speechwriter at the White House that Rove gave you the impression of a miner working in the last bit of an exhausted seam, and that was interesting. What always struck me about Rove was that seemed exactly right. Like that while he talked a game of being at the beginning of this starting this 30-year conservative Republican era comparable to 1896, his behavior was really kind of the way you would behave at the end of such an era, where you're just trying to grind out the last little, lock as much in permanent because you essentially the political climate was actually ending, and you're just going to grind out just as much. And I thought his political genius was that understanding that you don't gain any, you don't get more power by re-electing a president with 65% or 70%, like Reagan in '84. You don't have any more power than with 51%, and the same kind of understanding in Congress when they had that, that principle of the majority of the majority of the majority, which basically meant, you'd eke things out on purely on party line votes when necessary. That's not the way you behave if you're building, a huge majority if you're building towards something that's going to that's growing. That's the way you behave if you're working with something that's shrinking and you just want to get the maximum value out of it. And what was interesting was that, it almost sounded like he was sort of, I don't know, drinking his own Kool-Aid, or, the expression I always use is smoking his own dope, in actually believing that they were going to expand the majority and add Hispanics and so forth, despite evidence to the contrary. And I guess I kind of wanted you to say a little bit more about that, about my reading of that, of what you were saying there.
Well, I agree with all of that. I mean, the insight was that, or the hope, the Rove hope, was you would take the traditional base of the Republican Party, and Rove could do the math as well as anyone, and he could see that was shrinking. That the party has, since the middle 1960s, since the late 1960s, been founded on middle America, middle class, middle education, middle of the country, married, middle-aged, with children, churchgoers, and that part of America is shrinking relative to the rest. The proportion of women who haven't had children by the time they're 40 has, I think, doubled since the 1980s. The proportion of Americans who never go to church or who say they're not religious is rising more rapidly than any religious denomination, as far as we can tell. Right. So he could do those numbers. So his idea was, well, why don't we take our core constituency, hold them in place with the promise of a tax cut, add the Hispanics and add the evangelicals. Mm-hmm. Now, where this is not like 1896 is when you're building a new majority, the issue finds the coalition rather than the coalition finding. You don't start with the coalition you want to build and then sort of carefully amass it. In 1896 there was a terrible, terrible economic downturn, and that suddenly made the hangover politics of the Civil War feel very irrelevant. Also, the Civil War had ended 3 decades before, and people didn't live so long, so that seemed like a long, long time ago. And then there was a scramble between the two parties who could offer a better answer, to the problems of this terrible downturn. Neither of them actually had a very good answer, but McKinley somehow persuaded people that he did, and that set in motion. And then prosperity did follow, and so the Republicans were in power for a long time.
Right. Well, he had the answer for his coalition, isolating the Western and rural.
Right. He offered his solution was hard money and tariffs. Right. And that probably wasn't a very good answer, but it was a very savage and short recession, depression really. And by the time he was up for re-election, the thing had sort of sorted itself out. So that's not what was going on. There was not some great issue that Rove was confronting, and the country didn't have a great issue before it in 2000. I guess the only issue it had was, what are we going to do with the Clinton surplus? Should we spend it or should we return it to the people? And that issue was one that the Republicans were very reluctant to address in a direct way. So in that sense, yes, he was doing the last hurrah, running the 1972 election campaign one last time, and it did work in 2000, and with a little help, it worked in 2004. I think under ordinary circumstances, it would not have worked in 2004, and it barely worked in 2000. It certainly won't work in 2008.
Right. The help being the addition of the national security
dimension, and that came roaring back to life, and the inability of Democrats then, as now, to articulate a compelling national security vision.
Right. Although, I think part of he obviously he was able to expand the electorate in one way, which was evangelicals, and not expand it expand the coalition in one direction, and I guess he expanded in the direction of Hispanics in 2000.
Well, there's a lot of doubt about that. Yeah. There's a lot of doubt as to whether he really did, whether Bush in 2000 and 2004 really did any better among Hispanics than, say, Ronald Reagan had done in 1984. And meanwhile, he did that with immigration promises and other things that corroded his coalition from within. I think one of the things that, if I were to say, what is what's wrong with all of this? I mean, isn't it the business of a political consultant to win elections for his candidates? The country does have these accelerating, accumulating new problems. And in this way, the 1896 analogy really is very powerful. That in 1896, the country had decided that it was, the Civil War was going to not vanish. I mean, it remains an issue in the national consciousness that you could not relitigate it in every presidential election. And you now have these new economic problems, and the parties had to come up with answers to them. Well, in the same way, American politics for a long time has been about deciding what is going to be the role of the state in an industrial economy. And the Democrats won that argument for 40 years, and then they began losing it for the next 40 years. And for all the ferocity of modern partisan debate, the fact is, I think that issue is really largely settled. That the role of the state, first, we don't have an industrial economy, we have a post-industrial one, and Reagan succeeded in putting an upper limit on the role of the state, and Clinton then put a lower limit on the role of the state, and we are probably for a long time to come going to bump along between the two boundary lines set by Reagan and Clinton.
Except that you do have if you take the health care plans, the climate change plans, some of the ideas of the Democratic candidates, and put it all together, you actually could wind up with a much larger role for the state, and one that in fact nurture. I think size of government is sort of the wrong metric to be looking at. It's kind of whether a good is provided, directly through the government, indirectly through the government, through tax incentives and so forth, or simply through the structured rules of what we require of people is less important than whether it's delivered or not. And you could do healthcare far more efficiently and have it be a largely state provision, and maybe we're heading in that direction.
Well, there are people who claim that, and this gets to point that I made at the end of that Rove article that generated, I think, some grousing from some of the Democratic world, where I said that a lot of the things that were wrong with with Rove-style politics, I begin to see growing up among Democrats, and there's some indignation that said, well, wait a minute, we have all these spanking new and exciting ideas, and I think there may be a question here: what does one mean by an idea? That I think there are a lot of proposals on the Democratic side. I think there are a lot of slogans on the Democratic side. But what I mean by an idea is something in which you sort of immerse to the acid test of really stringent criticism. I mean, you just said that if you could have a state provisioned healthcare system that was somehow more efficient. Well, I think you can construct a sentence in which all of those words appear side by side. But can you do it? And when people say it, I don't think the people who say that have really taken on board the half-century of critique of why non-competitive systems can't develop, can't have efficient innovation. They just don't do it. And so what they do is they look at, I don't know who's in fashion this month. Whether it's once upon a time it was the Germans, and then it was the French, and next will be the Belgians, or maybe the Luxembourgers. And they say there's a system that at this moment seems to be meeting some criteria, and if we copy that, and I don't think they pay attention to. I mean, there has been a lot of work done to say that by a lot of intellectuals of different partisan points of view to say there are reasons why when you have non-competitive systems. In times of rapid change, which is what we're going to be, and I think change in healthcare is only going to accelerate, it's going to be very difficult without competitive mechanisms for them to deliver innovation and to find constant new efficiencies and constant new economies.
Right. Well, I mean, the French is a good model. It's been a good model. It remains a good model. It's adequately funded, and there seems that, and we can build a system that has that has plenty of competition where you want the competition to be. I mean, government can construct a real competition. Often it doesn't because those with the greatest financial power are able to buy certain advantages, like those companies that are now being subsidized in the Medicare Advantage program, for example. So often when we do things where we call it private sector, it's actually the government very much privileging certain winners, so that you really are wiping out competition. And I can imagine a system that does a lot less of that, but is in fact more public. Now, whether what counts as an idea or not, I mean, I thought you were kind of going to move in the direction of saying, well, there are sort of narrow policy proposals, but there isn't the grand vision sort of idea, or the you know, I mean, I think I think the Democrats are reluctant to sort of say, here's a different way we can really order our basic social contract. Instead, they sort of say, you know, here's what I'm going to do on health care, literally per se, and it's only if you really add them up that you see the sort of audaciousness of the liberalism that they're beginning to move towards, carefully, because it could all fall apart in a minute if there's a tax, you know, if there's a reaction to the. You know, if you reignited a tax revolt, forget it; it's done.
Well, if a grand, bold vision that you don't dare avow to the voters is probably not one with a lot of prospects of success. That I'm a great believer in politics. That you have to do the called shot. Remember that famous moment with Babe Ruth, and people dispute whether it ever actually happened. Where he pointed at the place in the stands where he was going to hit the ball.
I've heard about it. I'm not actually there.
Okay, and I heard about it from my son actually, who follows baseball.
Yeah.
But I think in politics that those are the only ones that count. You have to begin by saying Ronald Reagan said, "Here's my big vision," and Franklin Delano Roosevelt by 1935 and 36 was saying, "Here's my big vision," and finding support for it, and that gave you leeway to experiment, because it's often going to be true that a lot of your individual proposals don't work. So if you're going to mobilize public support, you have to have some way of summing up what it is that you are trying to do. And Roosevelt was pretty clear. He was trying to take the United States in the direction of social democracy, which is a concept that people understood in the 1930s. And Ronald Reagan was pretty clear. And so if you don't dare say that, well, we're going back to social democracy, you're going to have trouble. I don't know that the Democrats really do mean that. I mean, you hear these various proposals from Democrats to say things like, well, we want to resuscitate unions. And you say, okay, why did the unions die? What happened to them? And I suppose, and then, you know, you'll hear people say things like, well, they died because, you know, of mean rulings from the National Labor Relations Board. And you know, you think, well, that's just childish. That's just childish. I mean, I've become interested in this again. Everything like old is new again. I've been pulling out all these books on union economics. I think I have one. No, it's not here with me, but it's called "What Do Unions Do?" and it's published in 1984. And it's like one of these last major studies of labor economics. It was written by people who are very sympathetic to unions, but their point was the power of unions. Unions were most powerful when they were able to deal with an employer that had large fixed investments of one kind or another, whether a steel mill or something like the gateways that an airline would have, and they weren't very expensive, but they were fixed. You couldn't pick them up and move them somewhere. So long as you have such an employer, it's vulnerable to the kind of pressure a union can bring, and so unions work. If you have fewer such employers, then unions are just not going to work, whatever the National Labor Relations Board said. So you have to take on board what it means to shift from one kind of economy to another before you can offer up your new ideas. And that is the kind of work I just don't see Democrats doing. I mean, there's a kind of, and maybe the blogosphere here has not been helpful, but there's a kind of heckler quality, I think, to a lot of the way Democrats think and talk nowadays, where words are put together as if they were ideas, and they're not.
Right. See, I mean, I don't agree with that. I think it is an empirical observation that the greatest correlation with the kind of decline in wages and so forth is a decline in the bargaining power of labor, which is correlated with the bargaining power, which is correlated with the decline of unions. Okay, you can make that observation. That doesn't mean, I don't think there's anybody, even my friends at the Economic Policy Institute, who think that we can, you know, turn the spigot and return to what Frank Levy of MIT calls the bargain of Detroit. I think the era when the middle class was essentially created by bargaining wages up within industries that were not that had big fixed costs and were not facing the same kind of international competition that they are now. We're not going back to that. But you can start with that empirical observation and then say, then what is it you want to do? And it leads you, for example, to say, well, for one thing, let's get healthcare out of that healthcare, which was a creation of that era. Let's get it out of that zone. It was a creation of that union era. We're not going back to that union era. That's why you need to get health care out of the employer relationship and into the individual relationship, which may mean a stronger role for government. Unions' bargaining power was an alternative to that stronger role of government. To me, that's a big idea. I mean, there's detail. I can fill in the details.
I think that's a big idea too. I completely agree with you. But now we're going back to the 90s, and in fact, the kind of policy, the rough policy consensus that there was in a lot of real ways in the 1990s. And one of the books that I someday have in mind to write is a joint biography of Clinton and Gingrich. And say,
you should write it this week, right before he announces for president.
Do it when I'm old. But because what you're describing there, that is a throwback to the Democratic Party of a decade ago. That really did take the pre-blogosphere Democratic Party, the pre-John Edwards and Barack Obama Democratic Party, that said, we really, when the Cold War ended and social democracy died, we lost a lot of what animated us as a party. And now we've got lots of these little proposals, and some of them are pretty interesting. But we have to take on board why our opponents were winning. I think a little bit of what has happened is, as the Republican Party has run into so much self-inflicted trouble, that is, it's not been beaten by the Democrats. It's just driven itself into the ditch and we can, for reasons I think that are well known to every viewer of Blogging Against TV.
Well, I love to talk about it.
Okay, but so the Republicans are in self-inflicted trouble.
Right.
So the Democrats have inherited the possibility of power, and their problem is they think they've earned it. As a very smart businessman, I know once explained the arc of business careers that first God blesses you by making you lucky, and then He curses you by making you think you're smart. Mm-hmm. And I think a little bit of that is happening to a lot of the Democrats, where they think, okay, that means every reactionary idea that Gary Hart tried to bash down in 1984 and 1988, it's safe for them to come out again, and that's just not true. That and your point about that I think it's exactly right. I mean that conservatives are concerned about the decline in the median income, or they ought to be. Why do we have politics? It's to make life better for the large majority of the population. So yeah, this is a huge problem, and a lot of it does have to do with changes in the bargaining power of relatively immobile labor against much more mobile capital. Right. And since you represent American people who are laborers, most of them, you have to be worried about that. And one way to help them absolutely is to get health care out of this, out of the employer package. Absolutely. And then we'll have slightly right of center and slightly left of center ways of doing that and rooting in the individual. But now we're talking like it's 1996, 1997 again, and we are not talking the way I think the Democratic Party and the audience for Democratic candidates wants people to talk.
But I'm talking about the Obama health care plan. I'm talking about the Edwards health care plan, and someday we'll see a Clinton health care plan, and it'll be pretty similar. I mean, what are Democrats talking about that's not this?
Democrats are not talking about severing the employer-employee relationship. Sorry, I think that's a big taboo. You're not allowed to say we don't want it. I mean, President Bush advanced an idea, and it was kind of it's not a very finally worked out idea, but that the core to healthcare reform is tax reform, and we have to begin to find some way. The purest way would be to say, we're going to tax benefits as income, and we're going to use that money and redistribute it somehow. Stuart Butler had that idea in the early 1990s. Right. Okay, we can't do that. That's politically impossible. So then let's make sure that if we can't tax everything, then let's make sure that everything is equally untaxed. And that was what President Bush suggested. That's not an idea that the thing that excites the Democratic voter is not severing the connection between health care plans and the employer and rooting them in the individual. What excites them is the thought that government is going to run this thing like in Europe.
Well, what excites Democrats is the idea of a universal benefit. Is the idea that we expand the scope of people who have health care coverage.
That's not true. If that were true, they'd all be supporting Mitt Romney, who is in fact the one guy who's actually done it.
Well, he's not supporting it, so why should they?
But he did it. He did it.
Well, he did it in an awkward way that was lucky for Massachusetts, and there are very particular reasons. See, we do focus on the details of this. There are very particular reasons why you could sort of almost make that work in Massachusetts, and they haven't quite, and you probably couldn't make it work other places. And the Bush proposal is really just another way of benefiting, of giving high income people a way to put money outside of the realm of taxes under the name of healthcare than it is a way of significantly expanding healthcare coverage.
Well,
Ted Kennedy did support the Massachusetts program. The problem is that to say use the Massachusetts program as the model for the country is not going to be an easy thing to do.
The key concept behind the Massachusetts idea that was there with President Bush, and it was there in what you were saying a few minutes ago, was this nexus between the way the tax treatment of healthcare and how it ended up being in the hands of employers. One of the things we were talking about before we started this conversation on the phone was your skepticism about big ideas presidency.
Right.
And I do tend.
Well, it's not skepticism. Let me spell out what prompted this thought, and then I do want to go back to some of what we were just talking about in the end of the Rove piece. You had an interesting piece about Fred Thompson a couple days ago, and the degree to which he's just sort of very consciously imitating Reagan.
Right.
And it's always been interesting to me that Democrats really have a bit of Reagan worship of their own, particularly in the way they contrast what they're trying to do with especially kind of later period Clinton. The idea of the sort of small bore political caution of the later Clinton years, and that extends into the congressional party during the powerless years of the more recent years. I mean, it's that sense that there's that it was really. There's a kind of growing respect and admiration for Reagan, and I worked for Bill Bradley, who had some of this and tried to sort of draw this out a little bit in his campaign against Al Gore, and so it's a hard point to make explicitly, but it's totally built in, which is this sense like bigger, ambitious idea president. This is what you want is the president who is putting the bigger, ambitious ideas out there. So that's the contrast that Edwards is trying to mark off against Clinton and Obama in a kind of very different way. Although I think there's a sort of Reagan model in Obama as well, in the way you'd imagine a totally new kind of coalition being built. And then I read just a little bit of this Robert Draper book about Bush, and one of the passages that was in the excerpts in Slate was just Bush ruminating about, well, the key to me is I'm a big idea president. I'm not about those little, and it was stated in a way that made me say, why maybe that's not the appropriate measure of maybe we're too transfixed still by the Reagan model of success, or to some extent the FDR model of presidential success. And operating on the big idea model can be a disaster too.
Yeah.
And that's what got me thinking about it. It's not mostly that's the camp I come from, but maybe hearing George Bush articulate exactly my vision of the presidency pushed me to the other side. I don't know.
Yeah, no. Well, look, these kinds of imitations can be painful. Can be painful to watch. I mean, when they had that big debate at the Reagan Library, I think the first of the major Republican debates, and all the candidates lined up, and they said, like Ronald Reagan, I'm an optimist. That was going to be their big selling point. And I'm thinking
they don't sound optimistic to me.
Well, it's worse than that. Is you think, okay, is our critique of what went wrong with the Bush presidency too little optimism?
Right.
We need a lot more optimism. He was always looking on the dark side and all the things that could go wrong.
Right.
Where Ronald Reagan, every great political leader is also a great innovator, and a lot of their trick is to make it look like they spend a lot of time pretending they're not innovating. So when Roosevelt ran in 1932, he spent a lot of time trying to make himself look like a Democrat in the tradition of the Jeffersonian Democrats of the past. And
he probably wasn't faking it, actually.
Right, he probably, because at that point in 1932 he wasn't a big ideas guy.
Right.
That only happened to him later. And I suppose the point is that there are precedents and things don't repeat themselves, and everybody is new. I mean, in Reagan's case, he ran this uniquely ideological campaign because we'd had this unique period of ideological hegemony. I mean, between 1935 and 1975, the United States had been governed by a set of ideas, probably more coherent, more consistent than anything in American history to that point, that there were people trying to govern the United States as something like a little bit less than a European social democracy. And then it ended up in series of failures.
Although they didn't say it either. I mean,
No.
just to go back
They had different
about
mixed,
being explicit about
it was
what
a mixed
you're trying to
economy. It was going to be a mixed economy. That was the idea. And Republicans and Democrats largely agreed. And Richard Nixon's ideas about how to govern the internal workings of the United States were not that different from that of most of his Democratic contemporaries. And the management of the role of the state and so on. And he was, I don't know if he actually ever said we're all Keynesians now, but he might as well have done.
Right.
So, and all of
I didn't know there was a question about that.
I think there is a question whether he actually said it,
I
but
better check that before I quote it.
but it all ends in a series of calamities between 1970 and 1980, and accelerating after 1975, and the old status quo is really in ruins. And so there's a market suddenly for somebody who'd always been considered a kind of outlier, a radical, to come in and offer something new. And I don't know. I mean, maybe we're in a situation like that now. I tend to think, though, that that the Reagan-Gingrich conservatism looks more exhausted than wrecked.
Right. Right. I mean, I think the particular Bush combination is kind of wrecked, and I think you could come back. It's hard to give it a fresh start, but it's easy to see it kind of coming back in a few years with a different face, or Mike Huckabee, or something like that. I mean, in a sense, when the way you say that, right? I mean, Thompson almost, represents the exhaustion of it.
Right.
Well, sort of. Well, he's not Reagan because he's much more sort of world weary and lackadaisical and they're just actually not particularly inspiring.
Reagan had things he wanted to do,
right?
And he told people what he wanted to do. And there weren't that many, but they were big. I mean, he was going to have this big tax cut. He was going to rebuild America's defenses, and he was going to project a new and more confrontational attitude toward the Soviet Union. So you know what you're getting.
Right.
And with Thompson, you really don't. And it's not clear to me that Thompson knows what he would do.
Right. Right. Do you have a candidate? Are you a Giuliani?
I'm pretty much leaned toward him. I think. For a lot of reasons. I mean, part of it was I lived in New York during the Dinkins years, so I have a very clear sense of what it was that he accomplished.
I lived in New York during the Giuliani years. That's why.
And then you were there. Were you there before?
Actually, I lived in New York in the Koch and Dinkins years, and then again in the second half of the Giuliani years.
So you saw the difference.
I saw a low point. There was a particular tragic low point in New York in that 1988, 89 period, and which is actually the end of Koch, and then some improvement, basically driven largely by the economy at the end of Dinkins, and then picking up doing Giuliani. I mean, I don't take Giuliani's achievement in law enforcement. I don't take that early achievement, the Bratton period. I don't take that away from him.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, it got nuts at the end of it. And the degree to which he sanctioned the essentially out of control police behavior was crazy, and people were sick. I mean, September 10th, 6 years and 2 days ago, people were so tired of Rudy Giuliani.
I'm sure that was true. They're always tired of you after 8 years, and they come to take for granted also the achievements. It begins to seem like normal and almost inevitable. But I don't know. I think one of the things I take away from the experience of the recent administration, I'd like to see the government of the United States run with a little less attention to the comfort and convenience of the people who hold the jobs, and a little bit more regard for whether or not they're delivering results for the public. And in this way, I mean, a lot of the question in politics is, are people ready for your faults as well as your virtues? And Giuliani's demandingness and his impatience, and the fact that he was not a comfortable employer, may be exactly what the country needs right now. I mean, it really would have been better, I think, if everybody at FEMA we're very conscious that if we don't do a good job, that we're going to be in a lot of trouble, and there's going to be someone very, very angry. And he's monitoring us the way that through those police statistics, he tried to monitor the work of each policeman on the beat. Are you delivering? Are you delivering, officer? Are you delivering? We could use a little of that.
Well, we could use a little of that, but this is also a man who fired Bratton, who was the police commissioner who accomplished all that, and hired a series of increasingly incompetent cronies, leading at the end to Bernie Kerik. So it's not like he fired the incompetent and replaced them with the competent.
No, but he did make sure that that these organizations knew there was somebody at the top who was watching how the organization performed, and I think maybe government should have a bias toward firing more people than it usually does.
Well, I'm fine with that. I'm fine with that. You have to go at 2:30. We have a. There was something I wanted to go back to in the discussion about Rove, which was the idea that the Democratic Party. I think we covered the no ideas piece, but the idea that the Democrats kind of want to follow the Rove path. Mm-hmm. And are sort of imitating Rove. And
you said something about that. Yeah, that was very interesting. Go ahead.
I think there are a couple things about that. I think there's one respect in which they sort of do want to follow the Rove path, which is the kind of expand the electorate rather than narrow it down. So there's I've written about this a little bit. The 90s model of politics, which is it's all about the swing voters. Mm-hmm. That kind of narrows things down on a very small group, and basically assumes, if somebody's in your base but not voting, it's not worth chasing that vote down. It's much more valuable to flip somebody in the middle, so you get a very, very narrowly focused politics. And Rove basically said we don't have to do that. We actually can. We can ignore the swing in the middle if we can expand to the outside. I actually wrote a column about this in the American Prospect shortly after the election, and I got a note from Karl Rove, and it's marked not for publication, so I can't do too much with it except say I got this note that said, "I read your column and you get it." So that was interesting to me, and I do think that's had an effect on both parties, and it changes politics in a way that I think is largely for the better. If you operate on the assumption that people who aren't voting can be brought into voting, mm-hmm. The whole tone and context of politics is going to be more flexible and interesting, and you've got new possibilities. Where I think they don't, where I think the progressive Democrats, netroots, whatever you call them, don't imitate Rove, is in the kind of narrow, the 51% victory, the maximum polarization for narrow victory sense. And I think that the interest I was at the yearly Coast Convention, which was a very serious and almost boring policy-oriented set of conversations, but to the extent that it's about political strategy, something like the 50-state strategy of Howard Dean is, that's the sacred writ. Yeah. The idea of being a real national party and not a regional party and not a marginal party. That's the holy writ for those netroots activists. What I think they often are trying to imitate, because especially younger people, especially people, and they don't necessarily have to be younger, people whose political consciousness has been mostly in the 21st century, what they often want to imitate is Tom DeLay, or what they see as effective about the Club for Growth, which is intense discipline within the party that they have, and that's what we're seeing right now in the frustration about Iraq. Well, different people have different Democrats have different views about Iraq, and there are people who are like, well, why the hell can't we knock some heads and get something passed that ends this war?
Well, I salute you. I wrote it when DeLay left office. I wrote a little piece about him for National Review, in which I said he's going to be remembered as one of the great congressional figures of all time. And I got a deluge of mail saying that's just the stupidest thing you've written in the last 24 hours. So that, which is to say, it was the stupidest thing you've written. I mean, it was a really. But I think that I'm glad that he gets some recognition. I mean, he was one of the, he was one of the great congressional tacticians, one of the great leaders of Congress, and a very difficult institution to do. I mean, there are others who can make similar kinds of claims, but not so many.
No, it's a minor, trivial thing, but just as an exercise of power, the man who managed to go in and reduce the number of appropriations subcommittees by 2 in order to give himself an advantage in getting appropriations for the NASA site in his which he first he did the redistricting to put the site in his district, and then he did the jiggering to basically take away the power from two cardinals. I mean, those people are more powerful than the majority, by far more powerful. He managed to eliminate two of them in order to then control the appropriations for them. That's just something that, as pure tactics, you just have to salute that.
Yes. But there's a lot to learn from it. Democrats have more difficulty than Republicans doing things like that because of the nature. I think this theory of politics is still true, and I sort of argue for it in this book I've written, that the way to think about the two parties, if the national motto is e pluribus unum, that the Republicans are there to represent the unum, that is, people who feel themselves to belong to some kind of national core, and the Democrats are there to represent the pluribus, people who feel themselves to belong to some kind of national periphery, whether they are economically or culturally or regionally or whatever it is, somehow outside the core. They gravitate to the Democratic Party, and that's been true for a long time. So in that sense, Democrats usually tend to have less in common with one another than Republicans do, and so it's much more difficult to unite them into an effective force. And that, I think, was the story of the years of the Democratic congressional majority. And if there's a Democratic congressional majority again, I think because of changes in the way population is distributed, it may not be so much a problem for Democrats in the future, but it will still continue to be true.
Right.
But just on your point about the 51%, I don't think Karl Rove wanted 51%. That was what he had to put up with. He wanted to win big. Everybody wants to win big, and it really. If he believed that it didn't make a difference whether you had 51 or 59%, he would have been believing something that's not true, and I think he's too smart to have believed that. It makes I was writing speeches in those first months, and believe me, how often, given the human instinct for cliche, how often your fingers type out the words, and that's the job the American people elected me to do. Oops, backspace, 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 backspace.
Right.
The inability to say things
that the Supreme Court elected me to do.
It really matters having that kind of. It also, I think, is a dangerous. It's a dangerous target to set yourself because you're probably going to miss. Since I went back and sort of looked up, if you add up, starting with 1900, every election from 1900 to, I think, Clinton, and then you average how much did the winner get. The winner winner through the 20th century up to Clinton averages 53% of the vote, which by the standards of any other democracy is a huge win.
And re-elections are going to be much bigger.
Right, that's right. But the 53% is the average margin for whoever wins.
Right.
And so when American presidents win, they do tend to win big. Now, we've had this anomalous period since 1992 where that has not been true.
Right.
And maybe that will continue for a long time. But you have to wonder whether the normal pattern isn't going to reassert itself. The presidents are going to get better at reassembling coalitions. Somebody's going to come up with a new post-Cold War, post-industrial economy vision of how the country should be, and is going to be able to build a consensus around it. Mm-hmm. And then, when you shoot for 51, you're probably going to hit 47.
Well, that would certainly be my view of it, and that's a little bit of a worry that I have about Senator Clinton's strategies, which they'll show you. Okay, you can win. You win everything John Kerry won, plus you win Florida and Ohio,
right.
and you're done.
Yeah.
And that seems a little narrow. I think that's. I think that if President Bush were looking for something like the Reagan mandate in 1984, the whole campaign would have been different. You don't run a totally negative campaign for re-election of a president if you want to.
I so strongly agree with that. I think that's really right. And I wrote some of this at the time. I thought more of it, and maybe in retrospect, I wish I'd written more of it, but I did write some of it about how that given how he came into office, and he needed to refound his administration after 9/11. And having failed to do that, he needed to refound it in 2002, or 2003, I should say, after the congressional elections. And having failed to do that, he really did need to do it in 2004. And I wrote an op-ed for the Wall Street Journal, I think the day after the 2004 election, saying, having, and I understand why you couldn't do this before, but having won this mandate, now is the moment to say, okay, you need to appoint Democrats to senior foreign policy positions, and real ones, right. Because you have to put this, if you don't put this war on some kind of broad footing, the moment there is bad news, and there's always bad news, you're going to find that you don't have a political constituency at all. Right. And that, of course, is just what's happened. I don't know why he didn't ask for a gasoline tax in his 9/20 in September 20th, 2001 speech. Even if you don't believe in it, sometimes and President Roosevelt dismantled his entire antitrust operation in 1941 to make sure that the Republicans supported his war, and he believed in antitrust. Right. So sometimes you just decide what's your most important thing, and then you give your opponent something that they really want, and the things they really want often tend to be things you care about a lot too.
Right. Right. Well, it may be. I mean, there's still a lot we have to learn about it. To me, I don't feel like the administration quite took September 11th that as seriously as it should have on its own terms.
Yeah.
They took it as, an excuse to sort of declare some large war in which then they could, exert various forms of executive power and things like that were as much ends in themselves as actual responses to the challenge that we faced.
Right. Well, I don't think the president thought as much as perhaps he should have about how do you manage the political support for a war like this when you know at the beginning that it's going to be long. And you keep saying things like it's going to be long, it's going to be difficult, and you have to think, well, I guess that means it's going to be not short and not easy.
Right. Right. Well, I mean, I don't think that they thought it was going to be long. I don't think that they thought the Iraq War was going to be long and difficult. I think they thought given that there is some chance that it will be not long and not difficult, let's act like it's going to be not long and not difficult. Mm-hmm. Right?
Well, that was reckless.
Yeah.
That was reckless.
I think we agree on that.
And that takes us, I think, one of the things that maybe I've asked to talk about, which is, on the gamut of people who take 9/11 seriously, I'm probably an outlier. It is something I literally, it isn't just that there's not a day. I mean, there's probably not, an hour in the day when I don't think, it's one of the great transforming experiences of my life. And I think I've, and it gets sort of maudlin to talk about it, but I just see the war ever since then. And maybe I had someone I cared about a lot, Barbara Wilson, who was a casualty that day, and maybe because I had a very vivid sense, although it's clear we now know they weren't aiming at the White House. I was there, I was evacuated, and I had some sense that my wife could have been a widow that day too, and I sort of have seen the world through probably predisposed to see the world through doom-haunted lenses anyway. I think that's it. Maybe it was because of my age, but the moment where I really made up my mind, I'm not getting off this planet alive, was that day, and ever since then, that thought has been with me. And so on a day of commemoration, what I keep marveling at is the way the commemoration of this day does seem to be dwindling in a way at an unbelievable pace. And the flags in Washington on September 11th were at half staff, but and maybe I'm projecting too much, but it just didn't seem to me to be present in a way that it has, and for the commemorations, they seem to have lacked the kind of meaning and spirit that they've had in times past. And I have to say, it makes me terribly sad.
Well, I have to say, I understand that, and I was in New York and right across the river in Brooklyn at the time, and it has very significant meaning for me as well. I do think that the degree to which it's been made a political tool since then has something to do with that. And the fact that Rudy Giuliani spent the day with Ann Coulter yesterday, has something to do with the sense of that it's been turned into a political show, and the fact that they did the Petraeus testimony yesterday. You can't keep doing that and also have it be treated as a day of sacred memory of what happened. And people's feelings are so, to me at this point, everything that's happened in the name of September 11th is almost at the point of being more tragic to me than the event itself.
Well,
I'm not saying quite because they're different, but it's almost overwhelmed by that, and that makes it hard to sort of separate out September 11th and say, treat it as the tragedy that it was.
All right, I don't know that tragedy is the word I'd use, but the atrocity maybe. But,
atrocity is a fine word.
But it's hard for me to imagine thinking that way. But even if I couldn't think that way or could imagine what it would be like to think the way you just described, I don't understand why one wouldn't react to that by saying, well, I'm going to claim it. My reaction is not going to be to diminish it or to say, well, then let's consign it to history or to the realm of tragedy. I want to reclaim it. I want to make it, I want to, if I think that President and Rudy Giuliani are claiming some kind of unique title to this thing, I'm going to deny them that unique title, and I'm going to say this is as important to me. And the response instead has been, and I think maybe you articulate some of the reasons for it, but I think it's really not just unfortunate, but really wrong, has been to say, well, in that case, since we don't like the way we think it's been used, that we are going to diminish it.
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't know that it's diminished. Words acquire a lot of meaning, and September 11th now has a lot of meaning accreted to it that is not merely the atrocity itself. And on that day, I mean, I don't know what I should have done differently yesterday to honor it, aside from thinking about it a great deal during the day. But it doesn't stop me from being outraged by the degree to which Rudy Giuliani pushes that button over and over again for purely political purposes, and the degree to which it is used to keep grinding out the Iraq War further, even though it's entirely unrelated.
Let me press you a little bit on that point, because you have teenage children, if I understand. Right?
I have a 6-year-old.
Oh, yeah. Lucky you.
who actually had never heard of, who was 6 months old at September 11th, and had never heard about it until yesterday. So she crawled into bed with me this morning and said, "Why did those bad men fly the plane into the building?" And we hadn't talked about that before. So that's my context.
But when your charming 6-year-old becomes a teenager, you will find yourself often having to explain to that person why they have to do certain things, even though other people are behaving badly, or even though they're provoked or in some way tempted to behave badly. And I find myself again and again quoting. God, I never thought I'd be quoting Mahatma Gandhi, but I do quote Mahatma Gandhi. That if you want change, you have to be that change. And if you think Rudy Giuliani is exploiting the day in a way you disapprove of, why not mark it in a way that you approve of? I mean, why sort of? I'm not suggesting you're tuning it out, but you are expressing an awareness, an agreement with me that there are people who are tuning it out and that they feel somehow politically entitled to do that. Why not honor it the way that you think is appropriate? And say, if Giuliani or whoever it is behaving wrongly, I'll behave correctly.
And what? Go do my own speech at Ground Zero? I mean, there's two ways you honor something. There's you honor it as a private, privately, and you honor it communally. And much of the yesterday's a significant amount of yesterday's communal honoring of it was the Petraeus hearing and the Rudy Giuliani Ann Coulter event. So I can't join in that. I can't join in Rudy Giuliani and Ann Coulter's version of how you publicly honor it, and so I can honor it privately, and that's I mean, I don't know that maybe there could have been an alternative, maybe there could have been, and plenty of people did honor it in different ways. I don't want to ascribe to everybody the idea that it was diminished. When I say it's diminished, in a sense, what it is it's kind of privatized, because the public version of how we've talked about it has been accreted with this profound politicization, which is tragic, and that is the original tragedy of the Bush era. Was taking something that should have been cause and something that wasn't responded to directly, and it became a profound instrument of politics. I'm not going to do that. I will do something differently. But that thing is a private thing.
And I suppose the thing that makes that possible is that while we may have thought at the time that we had an understanding of a consensus on what actually happened, what the event was, but maybe we didn't. And I mean, in my memory of the day, that there is not that in addition to the loss and suffering, there's also dishonor and humiliation and the sense of the nation being attacked, and that does seem to require a response that is more than mourning, but action. I mean, this is not the Johnstown flood. It's Sumter. It's Pearl Harbor, and those things do require a response that is in some way political, because you have to summon the resources of the nation to retaliate against those who do this thing.
Mm-hmm. Well, fine. And I mean, are you saying that I should have gone off yesterday and shot some Islamofascists?
I'm not telling you what to do at all. I'm just, I don't know. I mean, I think, I don't know. I think, I don't know. I just wish things were different. That's all.
Yeah, no, I wish things were different too. I wish the public way we responded to September 11th was different in 100 different ways. And I wish Democrats had dealt with it in some different ways. But above all, I wish that those who held the public power had responded. I wish the whole thing had been different. And I think what I'm saying, if I can articulate it a little differently, is that my wish for things to have been different in the response to 9/11 over the course of 6 years is as great as my sense of that moment itself was.
Well, I think you speak for a lot of people.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and I don't think we're as far off, even though I do think. I mean, I think we put different meaning on that, but yes, a lot of things should be very different.
And on that note,
okay, next time we're going to talk about
things that should be the same
and things like that. All right.
All right. Thank you, Mark.